Hello everyone and welcome to the Waiver Wizards, where we make fantasy football a reality. From waiver claims to injury reports, we have everything for fantasy football. I'm Drew Gibson, and alongside me is my co-host Brooks Kennedy. Brooks, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good, Drew. I'm glad to be here on this lovely day. I'm ready to talk some fantasy football with you.
Yeah, really excited to be doing this show. Before we get started into our first segment, let's just talk a little about how we got into fantasy football.
Well, I got in during a family league, and I have been playing in that league for around 6 years now. How about you?
Yeah, I've been playing fantasy football for about 3 years. Not as long as you, but I've also been in a bunch of leagues and have really enjoyed and gotten to learn about it. How about some of your favorite NFL teams? I know you're wearing one of your favorite jerseys there.
Yes, I'm a Patriots fan. My Mac Jones jersey is on the way, and I'm excited for this season. How about you?
Yep, I'm also a Patriots fan and really enjoy them. They're having a great season. I think they're doing better than expected. I'm also a Bengals fan, as you can see. I've just kind of liked them since my childhood. I always enjoy following kind of a second team. So the Bengals are my second team, and they're also having a good year. So let's just jump right into some starts or sits for the week.
Yep.
So for the Cowboys versus Saints, who are you thinking of starting or sitting?
Well, I would like to sit Deontay Harris this week against Dallas. Trayvon Diggs, an all-star corner, well, he probably will be a Pro Bowl corner, will be covering him, I assume, with the bad wide receiver core, the Saints, and he is looking like the best option. They probably won't throw the ball too many times to Deontay Harris because Trayvon Diggs will be covering him. Anyone for you in this matchup?
Sure, I want to talk about Dalton Schultz of the Cowboys. In the past few games, he's only averaged about 8 points, which is okay for a tight end because tight ends don't necessarily score a lot. Last game, he did find the end zone, so he did have a bit of a better game than projected. But I'm going to actually sit Schultz in this matchup because I'm afraid that with all the weapons Dallas has at offense, that Schultz is going to have a minimal role in this game, and I think he's not going to find the end zone or have many receiving yards. And how about the Colts versus Texans?
Well, in this matchup, I would like to sit David Johnson with only 4.2 points per game. I don't think he'll get much more than that. And with not having a game over 7 points since week 1, I don't think he'll get over 7 or anywhere close to being a starting running back this week. How about you?
Sure. So I want to talk about Carson Wentz this week at quarterback, who's an interesting case because obviously the Colts have been doing quite well with Jonathan Taylor, who's put up quite impressive games against Tampa Bay, and then obviously before with Buffalo, having over 40 fantasy points. I'm actually going to give Carson Wentz a start, though, in this week against a Texans defense that allowed 21 points to a pretty weak Jets offense last week. I think that the Colts will have a pretty strong air attack in this game, and I like Wentz finding the end zone a few times and getting some fantasy points. Although, obviously, if you do start Wentz, you're going to run the risk of Jonathan Taylor dominating the game and kind of carrying them. So be careful with this decision, but I like Wentz as a sit for this game. Start.
I do agree. Let's move on to the Dolphins versus Giants matchup. This week, I will have Kadarius Toney in my starting lineup this week. This is because of the bad Dolphins defense that has been getting better, but I don't think they have any shutdown corners at the moment. And if he just hits 1 to 2 big plays, he could get you up to 12, 15 fantasy points, especially with a touchdown. This game has potential to be a high-scoring team with both teams not having the best defense, so I think the upside is worth it. Anyone for you in this matchup?
Sure. So I have Jalen Waddle as a start in this matchup. Waddle's been obviously trending up these past few weeks and is having a pretty good rookie season, I think. Obviously, with the one less preseason game, rookies have seen a lot less snaps, and I think as the years progressed with a lot of these rookies, as we'll talk about later, they've really started to grow quite a bit. And I think Waddle is one of the players that's taken up a much bigger role in the Miami Dolphins offense. I'm going to give Waddle a start in this, and the Giants are 22nd ranked in defense, so I like Waddle in this matchup.
Yeah. I do agree. Let's go to the Falcons versus Buccaneers. In this matchup, I like to start Leonard Fournette, and yes, there is a little bit of recency bias here, as he put up 4 touchdowns last week. But I do think he could get close to that with maybe 1 or 2 this week against the Falcons. The Falcons' defense doesn't surprise you at all. They're not really good, not totally bad, but against this really good Buccaneers team, I think the Bucs will be winning, and I think they will look to run the ball this week.
I'd say that's pretty accurate, although you never know with these division games because they can turn out to be a close game, and you never know, Brady might need to be using the pass attack more in the final stretch.
Yep.
In this game, I'm going to go ahead and sit Kyle Pitts, which is obviously, if you drafted him this year, you probably drafted him pretty high, and he has been doing okay, although these past few games, he's been playing a bit below average, which is okay. I think Pitts isn't going to be having an amazing game this game against a very good Tampa Bay secondary and linebacking core. So I'm going to give Pitts the sit in this game. Brooks, I know you don't really agree with that, but...
No, I don't. Again, with my prediction, I think that the Buccaneers will be winning this game, so I think they will be the Falcons will have to be throwing the football a lot during this game, and I think Pitts is one of the only targets they can really target in this offense, especially with not too many shutdown corners in that Bucs defense. Let's move on to the last of the games that we'll be talking about, in the Broncos versus Chiefs. Do you have anyone?
Sure, so I'm going to go ahead and sit Jerry Jeudy in this game against the Chiefs. The Chiefs' defense has been okay this season, but the bigger focus I have and bigger issue I have with starting Jerry Jeudy is the Broncos have so many options at wide receiver, including Tim Patrick and KJ Hamler, which are great options, and Cortland Sutton is also coming back from injury. There's so many options at wide receiver that it makes for an inconsistent fantasy on a week-to-week basis. I'm a little worried about Jerry Jeudy not having a good game. It's really one receiver for Denver every week that seems to have a big game.
Yeah, you never quite know with those Denver wide receivers. I'm going on the Chiefs side, and I'm going to sit Clyde Edwards-Helaire. And yes, I do think the Chiefs will win this game. I couldn't say if they've been winning this entire game. That usually leads for a running attack, but with the Chiefs, you never know. With Mahomes, they always try to do something special and don't go the average route, which is running the football. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is a pretty good running back, but the offensive line is improved, but is still not great, and I don't think he'll get too many fantasy points this week, and he's depending on finding the end zone.
Yeah, Mahomes can definitely carry the offense if he needs to. Obviously, he's got Kelsey at tight end and speedy Tyreek Hill, and Mahomes is actually a decent rusher for quarterback if you ever were to need him as a running option.
I agree.
So let's talk about some waiver claims, and I'm going to talk about some players I'm adding this week. One of them is Pat Freiermuth for the Pittsburgh Steelers. The rookie tight end has been doing quite well this season. He's obviously taken a bigger role in the Pittsburgh offense. Surprisingly, only 65.9% of ESPN fantasy leagues have Freiermuth rostered. I'd recommend you pick him up as he's taking a bigger role. Big Ben, I think, is heading towards the end of his career, and it's always nice to have a reliable tight end, and I think that Freiermuth is filling that role as a very reliable tight end and has been kind of finding the end zone, having higher receiving totals in these past few games.
I agree. I love seeing Freiermuth. Penn State, my favorite college. I saw him in college. I love his play, and I love that he's doing great in the NFL.
Yeah, definitely an impressive season for him. Another team I want to add is the Miami Dolphins defense. This may become as a bit of a surprise, but the Miami defense has been flying a little bit under the radar, especially their special teams last week with a block punt. Whenever a defense or special teams can score a touchdown, that's quite a bit of fantasy points, and I think that has good value. Going against the Giants offense has been relatively inconsistent this year, and there's not much explosiveness to it. So I'm going to think that the Miami defense will shut it down, and it'll be a low-scoring game. So I'm going to go ahead and recommend that you pick up the Miami defense. This obviously is a bit risky, but I think there's a high upside to picking them up.
I agree.
And a final player I want to add is Elijah Moore of the Jets. I think he's really taken the role as a wide receiver one and is establishing himself as a player that the Jets actually want to kind of make as a franchise player. I feel like the Jets have always been rotating out different players, and it's kind of interesting to see that. But I think Moore is actually someone that the Jets have succeeded in drafting, and I think he's going to be a good player over the years. So I'm going to go ahead and say you should add him. 68.5% of ESPN fantasy leagues have him rostered, and that number's jumped 27% over the past week. So I'd recommend picking him up while you can.
Well, there's not too many Jets that are on the roster, so you do know he's special.
Yep.
For those roster spots that you just added players, you do need to drop some players to fill up those, to empty those spots. So one player that I've already talked about is David Johnson. I think it's time to drop David Johnson. They proved that they're not that, the Texans have proved that they're not that dependent on the running game, as trading Mark Ingram and cut Phillip Lindsay. They just don't like the running backs that much, and with only averaging 4.2 points and hasn't gone over 7 points since week 1, I think Johnson is slowly declining in his career, and I don't think he'll do anything else this year that could be a starting running back numbers. The next person I think you should drop is Julio Jones. As being on the IR right now, you might have him in an IR slot on your fantasy team if you have one of those, but if not, I suggest you taking him out of your roster because only averaging 6.6 points for me is not a starting wide receiver numbers, and I do think it will be on a decline, even though the Tennessee Titans will be losing maybe a little bit more games with Derrick Henry out, but he might see a little bit raise in those numbers, but still not starting numbers. And the last one, I think, is Curtis Samuel. Not a lot of people have him on his team, on your team, but if you do, I suggest dropping him. With only 1.5 points, and he's been very injury prone, I think you should drop him if you ever had any hopes of him being good in this Washington offense.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of those drops, especially David Johnson and Julio Jones. I think both of them, people drafted them earlier in the rounds this season, and they had quite high upsides, but I think they've kind of failed this year, and it's time to get rid of them. So moving on, let's talk about some injured players, and surprisingly, some of them I think are on quite a few of your rosters, so let's talk about that.
All right, so number 1, Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry was the best running back this year and last year before getting injured. You could maybe still keep him if you're expecting to have a playoff run and a championship run, but if you need to get some wins right now, you might want to drop him. Someone might not pick him up, and you might be able to pick him back up if you make the playoffs. With a broken foot and has surgery on it, he might come back for your championship if you have a very late championship, maybe in like the 16th week. But other than that, I think you should drop him.
Yeah, I think Henry is no source of reliability for the Titans, and for late season runs in fantasy, I think you should not keep him on your roster and look for other players. He's certainly not going to be a sign of dependability, but you could keep him on the IR slot because if he does come back, obviously you could be looking for somewhere north of 20 points, which is obviously a huge boost. Another player I want to talk about is Chris Carson, and unlike Derrick Henry, he has no hope to be coming back this season. Over 48% of ESPN fantasy leagues still have Carson rostered. You need to get him off your roster because he's been battling neck injuries all season, and he's scheduled to have surgery soon this offseason. Carson will not be returning for Seattle, and I think you need to find better options on the waiver wire. You obviously do because he's not coming back. I think obviously his stock in fantasy has continued to go down as he's always seemed to be quite injury prone and not reliable as a running back.
Yeah, I haven't seen him healthy in a couple years now. You could pick up DJ Dallas from Seattle or maybe Alex Collins, but other than that, there's not too many running backs in that Seattle offense. Now let's move to DeAndre Swift. Swift suffered a shoulder sprain versus Chicago on Thanksgiving Day. He is listed as questionable going to the game against the Vikings and will be a game-time decision, so keep an eye on DeAndre Swift this week, as he could be a very good play this week if they need to pass the ball to him against this Vikings team this week.
All right, and the final guy on our injury report is Darren Waller of the Raiders, who suffered a knee injury on Thanksgiving also. This injury seems to be a bit more serious than Swift's, and Waller is listed as questionable for the upcoming game against Washington. I'm a little worried about Waller, and I think if he plays, he'll be seeing limited snaps, but obviously if he's going to start, I'd recommend starting him and keeping him as your starter, but be mindful that he could receive limited snaps or not even start at all.
Well, actually, there's one other injury player that just came in earlier this week, and it's Christian McCaffrey with an ankle. He's done for the year, so there's no hope for him coming back. Panthers already said he's out for the year. You might as well just drop him, probably pick up Chuba Hubbard, and hope maybe another running back in that offense. I think Cam Newton could go up since everyone knows he is a rushing quarterback and he is very good in the red zone. I think you could see even more of that going on.
Yeah, I think one question fantasy owners are going to have this offseason is Christian McCaffrey the best running back in ESPN fantasy football or any fantasy football league with PPR? Do you think he is?
I think he is if he's healthy, but now with the past 2 years of him not being healthy, I don't know if I could pick him.
I know. First pick, it's going to be interesting next year, and we'll obviously have that all covered for you. So moving on, let's talk about your favorite position in each league and the best start.
Well, so I think at my quarterback spot, I think Tom Brady will be the best quarterback this week. He's the third overall fantasy quarterback for the whole season, which is kind of surprising of how old he is, but the Tampa Bay Buccaneers like to see it, and I think he can keep on going against the Falcons. I think he got 29 points against the Falcons in the first meeting, and I don't think he'll get shy of that. I think he'll get roughly around that. I do think, like I said, Leonard Fournette will touch the ball a little bit more, establishing that run game going into the later season. But I do think Tom Brady will have a very good game, and he could definitely be a top 3 or the best quarterback this week.
All right, and my number 1 this week is Patrick Mahomes going up against the Denver. Denver has had a defense that has struggled. It's been all right. They did have a pick 6 last week, but I think Mahomes is going to dominate in this game. The Chiefs are obviously heating up, and Denver's 3-0 start is feeling quite distant. I don't think the defense is going to be much of a struggle for Mahomes in this game. Moving on to running back, who's your number 1?
Mine is Dalvin Cook. He is a little questionable this week, so you have to look out for that. But Dalvin Cook against the Detroit Lions is a great matchup. The Lions don't necessarily scare me at all, and I think Dalvin Cook in the past could have really good numbers, and in the past he has done really well against Detroit.
All right, and my number 1 is Jonathan Taylor going up against the Texans. The Texans don't really have a lot of superstars on their defense, and I think he could obviously go off in this game, getting a few touchdowns potentially, and potentially being the main controller of this game against the Texans. Taylor has had some amazing games as of late. He had an impressive game last week against Tampa Bay, and then he obviously had that 45-point game in Buffalo against a pretty good defense too.
I do agree. Coming in, my number 1 wide receiver this week is Justin Jefferson. I'm going to talk about the same Detroit defense I talked about Dalvin Cook. And again, they don't scare you on the ground or the air. They don't have any lockdown corners, and I don't think they can really control Justin Jefferson back there. Justin Jefferson has had good production the past 2 weeks. He's seen lots of targets, and I think this could be another good week where those targets turn into deep catches.
Yep, and my number 1 this week is Cooper Kupp, obviously one of my favorite players in the league, and he's got a really favorable matchup this week against Jacksonville, who's not been very good. They've allowed quite a few points to wide receivers. Kupp is still the wide receiver 1 in the Rams, and I think with Robert Woods' departure, he's become more and more of a bigger part. He didn't play as big of a role last week and played a little bit below average, but I think he's due up for a big game this week. He's averaged 21 points in fantasy this year, and I expect him to find the end zone and have a big game against Jacksonville.
Yep, I would love to see another Cooper Kupp performance unless he's going against me. For my tight end this week, it's Rob Gronkowski. He has been amazing. In his last 2 games, he has 13 and 19 points. He sees a lot of targets from his good friend Tom Brady, and I think this connection can keep on going. Against the Falcons, again, not too scary of a defense, and I think he could get a touchdown or 2 before the first half is done.
All right, and my number 1 this week is Travis Kelce going up with Patrick Mahomes against the Broncos. Again, this is not a very scary Broncos defense. I think Mahomes and Kelce can combine to have both pretty good games as they plan to do, as they've continued to rise and be quite impressive this season.
Yep.
All right.
I do agree.
Well, that's all we got today, folks. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the Waiver Wizards. I'm Drew Gibson.
I'm Brooks Kennedy.
Thank you for joining us. Next week, we'll be talking about Week 14 matchups and potentially playoff previews for your fantasy football league. This has been the Waiver Wizards, making fantasy football a reality. Thank you.
Thank you.